Meg Calloway, 28, auburn hair loose around her shoulders, white blouse, teal cardigan, the kind of young woman who looks entirely at home in a library or a garden or a conversation that matters, and entirely out of place in a room full of people performing grief while quietly calculating inheritance. A freelance illustrator from Portland, Oregon, who had spent her childhood being told, in the low-grade persistent way that families sometimes manage without ever quite stating it outright, that she was the soft one, the impractical one, the one who drew pictures and read too many books and did not have the particular kind of intelligence that her father valued, which was the loud, assertive deal-making kind. She had spent 28 years building a life that proved none of that was true. She had simply been building it quietly, which meant the people who needed proof, the loudest, were the last to see it. Walter Calloway, 79, gone now 3 weeks. A self-made man in the fullest sense, started with nothing, built a regional lumber business from a single truck in 30 years of relentless work, sold it at 72 for more than anyone in the family had known to expect. He had been, by the accounts of people outside the family, a man of considerable warmth and humor and the specific generosity that belongs to people who remember what it felt like to have nothing. Inside the family, he had been more complicated, not unkind, but a man of his generation and his habits who had loved imperfectly and had not always known how to say the things that needed saying to the people who most needed to hear them. He had died without a will, or so everyone believed. Richard Calloway, 55, Meg's father, Walter's only son, a man who had spent 30 years living in the shadow of his father's achievement, and who had handled that shadow the way some people handle things that diminish them, by finding someone smaller to stand next to. Meg had been that person for most of her life. Her brother Daniel, 31, broad-shouldered, confident, everything Richard recognized as worthy, had been the other kind. There are people who carry us quietly, not the people who tell us loudly that they believe in us. Those are good people too, and their voices matter. But the ones who carry us in a different way, who watch from a little distance, who notice the things we do when we think no one important is paying attention, who file those things carefully over years and decades in places we cannot see, and who sometimes arrange for what they have been carrying to be delivered, long after they are gone. The gathering after the funeral was at the family house in Eugene, Oregon. Walter's house, the one he had bought in 1987, the year the business turned its first real profit, and which he had maintained ever since with the slightly bewildered pride of a man who still, 30 years later, couldn't entirely believe it was his. Dark wood floors, a back porch overlooking a garden that had gone slightly wild in the last years, the smell of old books and coffee, and the particular mustiness of a house that has been well lived in for a long time. Meg had driven down from Portland the morning of the funeral. She had not brought much: a bag, her sketchbook, the navy dress she wore to occasions that required something between formal and sorrowful. She had stood at her grandfather's grave and felt the loss of him with the specific texture of losing someone who had been, in his own imperfect way, the member of her family who saw her most clearly. He had called her every other Sunday. That was not nothing. In a family where Meg was often the audience rather than the subject, Walter had called every other Sunday and asked about her work, her life, the book she was reading, the illustration project she was finishing. He had kept every card she had ever sent him. She had seen them once in the drawer of his nightstand, a stack of them, rubber-banded going back 15 years. She had not told anyone she had seen them. She had simply carried that knowledge, the way you carry something that belongs entirely to you. The afternoon gathered itself in the living room. Extended family and neighbors, a few old business associates of Walter's who came with the respectful, slightly formal manner of people paying a debt of regard. Food on the long table, the kind of food that appears at these gatherings. Casseroles and pies and platters, brought by people who understand that feeding is the most useful form of comfort. Meg sat with her Aunt Carol, Walter's younger sister, 74, a retired schoolteacher from Bend who had driven 4 hours and who was the only other person in the room. Meg felt entirely herself around. They talked about Walter, the real Walter, the stories that don't make it into eulogies, the ones that are better, the time he had stopped on the highway at 2 a.m. to help a family with a flat tire and had ended up staying an hour because the father was from Guatemala and Walter had wanted to practice the 6 words of Spanish he knew. The way he laughed, starting slow, then taking over his whole face. He loved you, you know, Carol said quietly, in the particular way he had, It wasn't always visible from the outside. I know, Meg said. He talked about your work, Carol said. To me, often. She paused. More than he said to you, probably. He was like that. He felt things more than he said them. Meg looked at the garden through the back window. I know, she said again. Richard gathered the immediate family in the study at 4 o'clock. He had, Meg understood as she entered the room, been waiting for this moment the way some people wait for a thing they have been planning without quite admitting they have been planning it. He was standing behind Walter's desk, standing, which was a choice. Meg, Daniel, their mother Linda, Aunt Carol, and 2 cousins arranged themselves around the room. Richard spoke about the estate. He had already been in contact with a probate attorney, he said. Walter had died intestate without a will. Under Oregon law, the estate passed to his surviving child, which was Richard. He named the number. Meg had not known the number. She suspected Daniel had known. There was a quality of unsurprise in his expression that told its own story. Richard said that he intended to manage the estate in the way he believed Walter would have wanted. He said this with the particular confidence of a man who has already decided what Walter would have wanted and has arranged for that decision to be indistinguishable from fact. He looked at Meg. Daniel will be the primary beneficiary going forward, he said. He's been involved in the business side of things. He understands how these assets work. A pause, the kind that is not really a pause, but a platform for the next thing. You'll be taken care of, Meg. Something reasonable. Something reasonable. The phrase landed with the weight of every something. Reasonable. She had been offered over a lifetime. She did not say anything. She had learned, over 28 years, that the rooms where Richard held court were not rooms designed for her voice. Aunt Carol looked at Meg, a look that Meg received and held. She went back to the living room. She sat on the old couch by the window. She looked at the garden going gold in the late afternoon light. She felt, not the anger she might once have felt, but something older and tireder. The weight of a pattern that had been repeating itself for so long, it had started to feel like weather. She did not cry. She was past the crying stage with this particular thing. She was in the stage that comes after, the quiet, clear-eyed recognition that some things simply are what they are. The knock at the back door came at 5:30. Most of the guests had thinned by then. Meg was in the kitchen, washing dishes, the useful task she always defaulted to when she needed something for her hands to do. Aunt Carol was beside her, drying. The knock was specific, not the knock of a neighbor or a latecomer with a casserole. Something more deliberate. Meg dried her hands, went to the back door. The man standing on the porch was in his early 60s. Gray hair, a good coat, a face that was careful and kind in equal measure. She did not recognize him. Meg Calloway, he said. Yes. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. White, sealed, her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized immediately. The way you recognize handwriting that has addressed birthday cards and Sunday letters for your entire life. Her grandfather's handwriting. My name is Arthur Benning, the man said. I was your grandfather's attorney for 18 years. He asked me not to come to the house until after the family meeting. A pause. He was a thorough man. Meg looked at the envelope. He said you would understand that sentence, Arthur said. He said you were the one who understood him. She sat at the kitchen table with Aunt Carol beside her and Arthur Benning across from her, and she opened the envelope. Inside were 2 documents and a letter. She read the letter first. That was what she would have done regardless. That was, as Walter would have known, entirely consistent with who she was. It was 4 pages, handwritten, in the careful slanted script of a man who had not written by hand much in the last years and had taken time over this. She read it slowly. Aunt Carol sat with her hands folded and did not say anything, which was the correct thing. Walter had written the letter 14 months before he died. He had also, at that same time, executed a second document, a comprehensive legal instrument that Arthur Benning had prepared with full compliance with Oregon estate law, a document that predated by 14 months the version of events Richard had just finished presenting in the study. Walter had known, he wrote, that he would die eventually. He wrote this with the dry humor that had always been his, eventually being the operative word. He noted, since at 78 he had been in no particular hurry. He had also known, he wrote, that dying without clarity was a form of unkindness to the people you left behind. And so he had tried to be clear. He wrote about the lumber business, what it had cost him, what it had given him, what he had learned from it. He wrote about Richard with the measured honesty of a father who sees his son clearly and loves him, and is not pretending otherwise. Richard is a capable man who was always more comfortable with things than with people. And I say this with love and without judgment because I was the same for too long. He wrote about Daniel. Daniel will be fine. He is well equipped for the world. Daniel has never needed me to worry about him, and I have taken him at his word on that. He wrote about Meg. He wrote 4 paragraphs about Meg. She read them slowly. He wrote about the Sunday calls, about the illustrations she had sent him, 2 of them framed, he said, on the wall of his study, which she had somehow never noticed, or had never let herself fully believe, were there because she was placed. About the way she had sat with him for 3 days, during the health scare in 2021, without being asked, driving down from Portland on a Tuesday, with her sketchbook and her steady presence and asking nothing except to be there. About a conversation they had had on the back porch the previous summer, the one she had thought was just a regular conversation about nothing important, in which he had told him something about herself, about her work, her life, the way she moved through the world, that had confirmed for him something he had known for years. He wrote, "You are the one who understood that the things that last are not the loudest things. You are the one who paid attention without needing to be noticed for it. I am sorry I didn't say this to your face more plainly. I am saying it now." Then he wrote, "The enclosed is not a consolation. It is a decision I made with full clarity because it is the right one, and because I want you to have the freedom to keep building the life you have been building without anyone's permission." The second document was the will. Arthur Benning had prepared it under full legal formality, witnessed, notarized, entirely valid. Walter had left the bulk of his estate directly to Meg in a trust structured to protect it from any contest. He had left Richard a substantial sum, generous, specific, with a note in the trust document that read, "This is what I would have given him regardless, and I give it without withholding." He had left Daniel a sum equally substantial, with a similar note. He had left Aunt Carol the back porch furniture and his copy of John Steinbeck's collected works, which made Carol laugh in the way people laugh when they are also crying. The total value of what he had left Meg was $47 million. Meg sat at the kitchen table and looked at that number. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She felt, more than anything, the particular quietness of someone who has just been handed proof of something they knew, but had not known how to carry, that she had been seen, that someone had been watching all along, from just a little distance, filing things carefully, over years in places she could not see, and had arranged, in the thorough and unhurried way of a man who understood that the things that last are not always the loudest things. For her to know it, Richard came to find her 20 minutes later, drawn by whatever instinct draws people in family houses, when something is happening in another room. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Arthur Benning. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Meg. She looked back at him. She did not have a speech prepared. She had not been building toward a moment. She was simply a young woman sitting at her grandfather's kitchen table with 4 pages of his handwriting in, her hands in the particular calm of someone who has just received something they did not know they needed. "Dad left a will," she said. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The legal process that followed took several months. Arthur Benning was thorough, as Walter had intended, as Walter had in fact specifically arranged. Richard consulted an attorney. The will held. The trust held. Arthur had seen to it that every formality had been observed, every possible challenge anticipated, every door closed gently but completely. Richard did not speak to Meg for 6 months. She did not chase the reconciliation. She had her grandfather's patience about it, the understanding that some things take the time they take, and that attempting to hurry them produces heat rather than light. When he did call, it was on a Sunday afternoon in autumn. She answered. The conversation was not easy. He was not a man built for easy. But he said, in the circling way of a person who cannot land directly on the thing but is trying, he made his choice. I don't entirely understand it, but I've been thinking about it for 6 months and He stopped. Started again. He saw something in you. He always did. Another stop. I wish I'd looked harder. It was not a full apology. It was the beginning of one. She understood the difference and accepted what was offered. "I know, Dad," she said, not forgiving everything immediately, not pretending the years were different than they were. Just, "I know. I hear you. I'm still here." She did not leave Portland. She did not buy something enormous or change her life dramatically in the ways that money sometimes changes lives when it arrives suddenly. She paid off her apartment. She took on fewer rush projects and more of the ones she loved. She established a small grant program for young illustrators who couldn't afford to take the risks their work required, named, quietly without announcement, after no one in particular. She called Aunt Carol every other Sunday, the same schedule Walter had kept. She kept the 4 pages of his letter in the cedar box on her desk, the one where she kept the things that mattered most. She read them, sometimes on the evenings when the old questions surfaced. Not for comfort exactly. More for the grounding of knowing that she had been seen, that someone had been watching, that the quiet work of a life lived with integrity had been noted and held and returned to her in the most complete way available. She kept his photograph on her desk too. Walter at 60, squinting into sun somewhere, Montana, she thought, a fishing trip she had heard about but never been part of. He was laughing at something outside the frame, the full-face laugh that she had tried once to draw and had gotten close. Perhaps this is what the quiet loves teach us in the end. Not everything is announced. Not every person who is watching us announces that they are watching. Not every person who believes in us says so on the schedule we need them to say it. Some of them carry it carefully for years, for decades, in places we cannot see. And sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, those things arrive. Not as validation exactly, not as proof in the defensive sense of that word, but as a letter on 4 pages of careful handwriting, as a phone call every other Sunday, as 2 illustrations framed on a study wall that you somehow never let yourself fully believe were there, as someone saying across time, across the distance that death creates between people who loved each other, I saw you. I saw what you were building. I saw how you moved through the world. And I want you to know it was enough. It was more than enough. It was in fact everything.